Good day everyone, Mars Kenneth Villaver is the name, and for today's video, we will have a discussion. Lend me your ears as we will about to know Robert Gagne's conditions of learning. Another theory, another knowledge. But before we start, let's have some trivia and facts. Let us know first the man behind this theory. Did you know that Robert Gagne is an American educational psychologist best known for his conditions of learning and instructional design implication that was first introduced in the year 1965? Did you also know that he is also involved in applying concepts of instructional theory to the design of computer-based training and multimedia-based learning? His work is sometimes summarized as the Gagne assumption that there are different types of learning outcomes, each of which is best achieved through its specific instructional design, but also that there is a set of steps required in every learning environment. In other words, learning requires proper process towards certain instructional design in order to acquire and absorb knowledge through an effective and efficient learning environment. Do you now have some knowledge about Robert Gagne? Okay, so much for that. Let me first introduce Gagne's principle. Robert Gagne has four principles. It includes first, different instruction is required for different learning outcomes, different types of levels of learning for different types of instruction. Learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned in a sequence of instruction. The specific operations that constitute instructional events are different for each different types of learning outcomes. Events of learning operate on the learners in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. First, states that different instruction is required for different learning outcomes. Different types of levels of learning for different types of instruction. Gagne's theory asserts that there are several different types or levels of learning. Furthermore, the theory implies that each different types of learning calls for different types of instruction. Of course, different instructional events is a necessity to achieve various learning outcomes. However, different learning instructions should always be considered, for there are various levels of learning that is in need towards in the process of learning. Second, the learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned in a sequence of instruction. Gagne suggests that according to complexity, stimulus recognition, response generation, procedure following, use of terminology, discriminations, concept formation, rule application, and problem solving. The primary significance of the hierarchy is to identify prerequisites that should be completed to facilitate learning at each level. Since the primary significance of the hierarchy is to identify prerequisites, what is prerequisites? Prerequisites are identified by doing a task analysis of a learning or training task. Learning hierarchies provide a basis for the sequencing of instruction. Third, the specific operations that constitute instructional events are different for each different types of learning outcomes. Gagne emphasizes that several different types of learning outcomes exist when such operations or tasks constitutes different instructional events. The last one is events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. Those events should satisfy or provide the necessary conditions for learning and serves as the basis in designing instruction and selecting appropriate media. And that explains Gagne's principles. We also have four elements that provide the framework for Gagne's conditions of learning theory. First, conditions of learning. Next, the five categories of learning outcomes. We have association of learning. And the last one is the 9 events of instruction. Conditions of learning. We have two different types, internal condition and external condition, that are common to all learning outcomes. Internal condition implies capabilities that already exist in a learner before any learning begins. These are the inherent capabilities of learner and are already present within him or her, even before any external learning begins. These internal conditions are transformed and they cause a change in behavior of a learner. This change is observable and proves that learning has occurred. External conditions includes different stimulus that exist outside the learner. These conditions are the learning situation, the learning environment, and any external aids such as books, videos, or audio that an instructional designer or a teacher uses to facilitate the learning process. The external are different at every point in the learning cycle for the same learner. This is attributed to the fact that learning might begin at a different point each time, and the external environment will usually be different for that point in time. Next is the 5 categories of learning with corresponding learning outcomes, and that is to be discussed by Jinky Ramirez.
The 5 categories of learning outcomes of Robert Gagne. One of the themes of Gagne's theory is distinguishing the types of categories that learning has. The categories of learned capabilities observed as human performances that have common characteristics. Gagne's described the 5 categories of human performances established by learning. These are the 5 categories of learning outcomes of Robert Gagne. First, verbal information. Being able to state ideas, knowing that, or having declarative knowledge. Example, face-to-face discussions, interviews, and debates. Second, intellectual skills. Knowing how or having procedural knowledge. Example, memory, comprehension, reasoning, analyzing, and problem solving. Third, cognitive strategies. Having certain techniques of thinking, ways of analyzing problems, and having approaches to solving problems. Example, asking the students to reflect on their experience and asking students to justify and explain their thinking. Fourth, attitude. Mental states that influence the choices of personal actions. Example, emotional and behavioral attitudes. Lastly, motor skills. Executing movements in a number of organized motor acts such as playing sports or driving a car. Example, sitting, crawling, jumping, running, and climbing stairs. The 5 categories of learning outcomes provide the foundation of describing how the conditions of learning apply to each category. Gagne postulates that if the 5 categories of learning outcomes and the ways of analyzing learning requirements are combined in additional and systematic manner, then it will be possible to describe a set of ideas that make up a theory of instruction, should attempt to relate the external events of instruction to the outcomes of learning by showing how these events lead to appropriate support or enhancement of internal learning processes.
Additionally, the 5 categories of learning with corresponding learning outcomes were discussed already. So, let's tackle its corresponding conditions of learning. In verbal information, there are four conditions. Number one, draw attention to distinctive features, vibrations in print or speech. Number two, present information so that it can be made into chunks. Number three, provide a meaningful context for effective encoding of information. And number four, provide cues for effective recall and generalization of information. In intellectual skills, we have six conditions, including calling attention to distinctive features, stay within the limits of working memory, stimulate the recall of previously learned component skills, present verbal cues to ordering or combination of component skills, schedule occasions for practice and spaced review, and use a variety of contexts to promote transfer. When it comes to cognitive strategies, there are three conditions. Describe or demonstrate the strategy. Provide a variety of occasions for practice using the strategy and provide informative feedback as to the creativity or originality of the strategy or outcome. In attitudes, there are four conditions. First, establish an expectancy of success associated with the desired attitude. Second, assure student identification with an admired human model. Third, arrange for communication or demonstration of choice of personal action. And lastly, give feedback for successful performance or allow observation of feedback. Last categories of learning is motor skills. There are four conditions. Present verbal or other guidance to the cue, the executive's subroutine. Arrange repeated practice. Furnish immediate feedback as to the accuracy of performance and encourage the use of mental practice. Let's proceed to Gagne'S hierarchy of learning. We have 8. The stimulus recognition or signal learning, also called classical conditioning. Response generation or stimulus response learning, also called operant conditioning. Procedure following or chaining, also called complex operant conditioning. Use of terminology or verbal association, also called creation of associations using verbal connections. Discriminations or discrimination learning, also called learning of responding to different stimuli. Concept formation or concept learning, also called learning a general response to a class of stimuli. Rule application or rule learning, also called a rule is a chain of two or more concepts. And last, problem solving, also called application of previously learned rules and concepts to new situations. And that is to be discussed by Marife Matas.
Learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned and a sequence of instruction. Learning tasks for intellectual skills can be organized in a hierarchy according to complexity. If we look at the applications of the 9 steps of different learning categories, there can be different steps required for each category, as Gagne proposed in his book, which is The Conditions of Learning. Hierarchy is to identify prerequisites that shall be completed to participate learning at each level to provide a basis for the request sequencing of instruction. Gagne, influenced with behaviorist learning theories, suggested there are 8 types of conditions of learning. Gagne's hierarchy of learning or 8 ways to learn. Mostly all based on SR learning, DR or DR. Stimulus recognitions were signal learning, classical conditioning. A general response to a signal like a dog responding to a command. What is conditioning? Conditioning is evolutionarily beneficial because it allows organisms to develop expectations that help them prepare for both good and bad events. Response generations or stimulus response learning or operant conditioning. Appraise response to a distinct stimulus. Procedure following or chain. Complex operant conditioning. A chain of two or more stimulus response connections as acquired. Use of terminology verbal associations or creations of associations using verbal connections. This is the learning exchanges that are verbal. So, example, there are five basic processes in operant conditioning: positive, negative, reinforcement, strength behavior, punishment, response cause, and extension, weaker behavior. Discriminations or discriminations learning. A learning of responding different to different stimuli or the ability to make different responses to a similar apparent stimuli. Concepts formations or concept learning. Learning a general response to a class of stimuli or a common response to a class of stimuli. Role applications or role learning. A role is a chain of two or more concepts or learning a chain of two or more concepts. Example, inductive role learning solve as applications problems the inductions of a role set of a decision list. Problem solving applications of previously learned roles and concepts to new situations. A kind of learning that requires higher order of thinking. Example, students apply critical and creative thinking skills to prior knowledge during the problem solving process.
Next tackles about the generalization towards one of the Gagne's principles that is to be discussed by Suzanne Mambu.
Content of learning operate on the learn in a ways the quantity the condition for learning service as a basic for designing instruction and selecting appropriate media. Design instruction skills are to be learned at the lowest level as a mastery before proceed. An instructor should using positive comment and repetitive when a new skill building upon step in plan instruction. Identity the type of learning outcome, the easy outcome have of skill that most identify that internal competition or processes the learning must have acquired the outcome. Identity the internal competition or institution need to acquire the outcomes. Certificate. The learning content record the characteristics of the learning. Training the media or institution plan to motivate and learning. Test the institution when learnings in the form of repetitive evaluation. After the statistician has begun received summative and evaluation, it has to be judged effectiveness of the statistician.
To clearly explain this concept, as what I have discussed earlier, that the events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the condition of learning that serves as a basis for designing instruction and selecting appropriate media. It means those events that will be discussed later should satisfy or provide the necessary conditions for learning. In terms of designing instructions, it is necessary that skills are to be learned at the lowest level and mastered before proceeding for effectiveness and efficient learning. It gives framework to discover more about who our learners are and how they learn. It also helps you identify the knowledge and skills of the learners. Aside from designing instructions, there are also steps on planning instructions. We have here, first, identify the types of learning outcomes. Each outcome may have prerequisite knowledge or skills that must be identified. Identify the learning outcomes that articulates the range of behavior, knowledge, and skill that makes up the basis of learning, and prerequisites that will serve as also as a basis for the task assigned to the learners. Second, identify the internal conditions or processes the learner must have to achieve the outcomes. Internal conditions such as capabilities possessed by the learners before any task given is in need in order to achieve the outcomes. Identify the external conditions or instruction needed to achieve the outcomes. External conditions that pertains to the learning environment, learning situation, and materials such as books and many more. Specify the learning context. Specifications of learning context will help the learners understand and acquire knowledge. Record the characteristics of the learners. The characteristics that will be a basis on what kinds of methods or techniques to use that will be suitable and that fits the characteristics of the learners. Select the media for instruction, like videos, presentation, or audios. Plan to motivate the learners. Spread positivity and determination inside the learning environment in order to help students to be more passionate and eager to learn. Test the instruction with learners in the form of formative evaluation. Evaluating formatively what Test the instruction with learners in the form of formative evaluation. Evaluating formatively will guide students to absorb the given instruction. Lastly, after the instruction has been used, summative evaluation is used to judge the effectiveness of the instruction, like giving of assignments, quizzes, and tasks. The last topic is 9 instructional events. It includes enhance retention and transfer, assess performance, provide feedback, elicit performance, provide learner guidance, present stimulus material, stimulate recall of prior learning, inform learners of objectives, and last, gain attention. And that is to be discussed by Maribel Lucon.
And now let's move on for the 9 instructional events according to Robert Gagné. First is gaining attention. This is the first step of instruction events wherein the basic idea is to grab the learner's attention by providing a creative motivation in attractive ways for them to engage with the context. So, like for example, showing the short interesting film to your students related what they are about to learn. And another example is providing a problem to be solved or presenting a new situations that will grab the learner's attention. For these events, the teacher must provide strategies or activities that can get the attention of her students. And for the second instructional events is informing learners of the objectives or the expectancy. So, what will the learners gain from the instruction or from the lesson? So, students needs to be clarified what they can expect in the discussion. So, the most important for these instructional events is informing the students what they will learn by the end of the discussion or for the lesson. In providing a learning objectives, it allows the learners to organize their thoughts on what they will learn and to perform. So, informing learners of the objective. From the word objectives, it is the what the teacher wants to her students to learn or achieve at the end of the lesson. And the third one is stimulating recall of prior knowledge or the retrieval. So, as for recall of existing relevant knowledge, prior knowledge or previous lesson should be activated since it is important for learning new materials. So, this event mostly happen after the motivation. You make a review for the past lesson. And the fourth event is presenting the stimulus or selective perception. So you are display the content. And presenting the material to the students, use like timelines, various examples, concept maps, diagrams, and encourage students to engage in the discussions, possibly using various learning styles that are related to the topic or give definition to discussions. And for the fifth instructional events is providing learning guidance or semantic encoding. Guidance in terms of communications enables the teacher to direct the students in their learning or enable them easier information encoding through visual or other materials that suit to their topic and provide realistic demonstration. So, in other words, the teachers facilitates the learning process by giving hints or the appropriate direction for the lesson. And for the six instructional events, it is eliciting, performance, or responding. So the learners respond to demonstrate knowledge. Students need practice. Practice should immediately follow instruction and be well defined in terms of its nature. So, objectives and expected students' responses. Make an activity out of group and let answer on the board to show their output. So, example of illicit performance. Practice. So, by letting the learner do something with a newly acquired behavior, skills, or knowledge, or in addition or demonstration is required. So, eliciting performance or responding based on the learning of the students for the discussion or the lesson. And for the seventh for instructional events, it is providing a feedback or reinforcement. So, give informative feedback on the learner's performance. Feedback happens after the performance or after the activity. So, what the use of feedback or reinforcement? Feedback is additional guidance offering the students immediate evaluation of his performance, enabling him to realize his mistakes and misconceptions. So, let the teachers make constructive correction whenever they are wrong or appreciate their works. So, in providing a feedback, it can be a form of test or quiz or verbal comments. Giving a feedback needs to be specific. So, for example, do not say that you are doing a good job, but tell them they are doing a good job and provide specific guidance. So, do not mention that you are doing a good job, but tell them why they are doing a good job. Give a specific guidance, specific comments about their performance. And the eighth one is assessing performance or the retrieval. So, more in performance and more feedback to reinforce information. So, at the end of each course, students' knowledge should be assessed in order to check if expected learning has occurred. Let individual learners answer the activity to measure their comprehension. It may be a quiz or oral recitation and motivate there to answer or provide some activities that can help them to test or assess their learning about the topic that discussed. And the last one is enhancing retention and transfer or generalization. Generalization mostly happen after the discussion and after the assessment. So the teacher make an generalization about the whole topic. So the learning process does not end when the class does. So the teacher should advise their students on how and in which context to apply and transfer the just gain knowledge in the world outside the classroom. So, gave more drill in order to practice the required learning. It means that the learning of the students must be applied in their real lives.
And that's all for today's discussion. Thank you for listening and watching.